tonight we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We'll talk about the high tides and turning points of the American Civil War, and we're going to be joined by a gaggle of guests. We're going to start up at the top left corner from what I'm looking at, and that'll be James Broomall. Jim Broomall, he actually is the director of the George C. Tyler Civil War Center at Shepherd University, which is in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. We're joined by Dan Davis, who is the Education Associate at the American Battlefield Trust. We have Dr. Chris Mikowski, who teaches in the School of Journalism up at St. Bonaventure University. Chris is also the co-founder of Emerging Civil War. It's a website. Phil Greenwalt, who is coming from the great state of Florida. He is our resident crocodile hunter. He works down in the Everglades, but don't let that fool you. Phil is actually the founder or co-founder of Emerging Revolutionary War, and he used to work for the Park Service at some Civil War sites. And then we have Kevin Pollock, who works for Prince William County. He is director down at Bristow Station Battlefield, where the American Battlefield Trust has worked to save a lot of land with our great partners down there. And I'm Chris White, the Senior Education Manager at the American Battlefield Trust. And we want to thank you for joining us this evening on Zoom Goes a History, talking high tides and turning points of the American Civil War. We hope that you'll share this with your friends, with your family. We'll be doing a lot of these Zoom sessions over the next few weeks because now us historians have a lot of time on our hands, and we can actually talk to one another using Zoom here. So it's been a great asset for us to use. So as we get started here, and I want to just kind of define maybe what a turning point is. So I'll throw it down to Chris Mikowski, who's a co-editor of the book on turning points of the American Civil War through Southern Illinois University Press. Chris, what do you think a turning point is per se in a war?
I think a really constructive way to look at a turning point is an incident that happens that irrevocably changes the flow of events. So whether it changes not just the flow of the battle itself, but then changes the flow of everything that comes after it. It's sort of like a major shift in the tide of events. And some of the turning points we might talk about today are maybe turning points that didn't happen, and sort of what we consider the flow of event could have turned out differently had something, a different change happened. But think about it as that irrevocable shift.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's an irrevocable shift one way or the other. That will turn the tide like a slow ship. Let's say you're trying to turn an aircraft carrier. Not all turning points are going to be very abrupt, like you could turn in a race car. A lot of times in warfare, a turning point is going to be like a large ship trying to turn in the ocean. And I figure probably the easiest way to go through this would be chronologically. The Civil War is 1861 through 65. So does anybody, and I'll just throw this out there, does anybody have a turning point in 1861?
Well, one thing I want to kind of jump on with what you just said there is you talk about a turning point. And I think that's really important because a lot of people think about the turning point, like the Civil War had a single turning point. But I think what you're suggesting, rightly so, is that there are a series of turning points that shift and change and sort of act like dominoes rather than maybe a single pivot moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's more than one. Most people think it's just Gettysburg. That's the culminating battle. But, the Civil War doesn't really end, for the most part, until April of 1865 with the dual surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse and then down at Bennett Place. There are plenty of other surrenders afterwards, but those are the two primary surrenders, the two largest. Lee's army with about 29,000, and then Joe Johnston's with nearly 90,000. He's going to surrender at Bennett Place. In 1861, you could be facetious and say Fort Sumter's the turning point. The Confederates started the war and it went poorly, kind of just like when Yamamoto attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and he said, I'm afraid we've awoken a sleeping giant. You could almost argue it from that standpoint as well. I see some friends who have joined us. We got Connor Townsend, Chris Quinn from Gettysburg, Andrew Dalton from the Adams County Historical Society. So thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. We hope you share this with your friends and your family. So let's jump into 1862. Obviously, 61's a hard one.
Actually, I've got a 61 that I'll throw out there just randomly, if that's okay.
Go for it. If you got one for 61, I'll be very impressed.
So I'll be throwing out to the very Midwest with what happens in St. Louis and in the state of Missouri with the Home Guard units between Nathaniel Lyon and the Southern-leaning governor of Missouri, and that what happens about holding Missouri in the Union in 1861 with when they try to take over the arsenal out there. The pro-Southern, State Guard is captured there in the city. And it kind of preserves some of that initial action in Missouri, preserves Missouri for the Union, which is one of those big border states. Imagine if they were able to get a pro-Southern government started, get Missouri somewhat out of the Union in 1861. It would have put Confederates farther north. And that timeline down to 62, 63, 64, especially Sterling Price and other ones that try to recapture those lost territories. You already have a pro-Southern Missouri, you have a turning point there as well. And some of your big major players, Fremont, Halleck, get started in that command as well. So went to the Missouri Civil War Museum and really caught what happened there in 61, which was very, very important, and also set up that kind of intra-Civil War with the Raiders and so forth that came later, Quantrill and the James brothers. So you really set up a civil war within a civil war because of what happened there in 61.
Yeah, things got very personal out there out west, and that's a good point about the border states. Jumping into 1862, I think one of the turning points, or the smaller turning points, that Chris Kulikowski, not Chris Murkowski, who's with us, Chris Kulikowski often makes, and Stuart Sanders does as well out in Kentucky, is Perryville. The Perryville campaign, or the Kentucky campaign of 1862 is important, because the Confederates are trying to pull Kentucky back into the Confederacy, because there are a lot of pro-leaning Southern people in Kentucky, but they stuck with the North. And largely this has to do with the fact that the Confederacy wants to restart the international slave trade. And one of the largest commodities, the largest commodity in 1861 being exported from Kentucky, is going to be slaves going into the Deep South in places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. So once the Confederates start to have to deal with moving up into Kentucky to try to take it back, it's an interesting story. Anybody want to talk Perryville for a minute without Chris Kulikowski here? I know he's the expert. Nobody wants to talk Perryville?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, really, I think the whole, all the Confederate offensives in the summer and fall of 1862, they're not coordinated, so to speak, from a higher level, but just the fact that there's at least 4 different Confederate offensives surging north, roughly in the summer and fall of 1862. Of course, you have Northern Virginia crossing into Maryland. You have Confederate offensives of a smaller sort in Western Virginia. Perryville, of course, as you mentioned, with Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg, and then also Earl Van Dorn moving on Corinth, Mississippi. And so I think a lot of this big Confederate surge in the fall of 1862 is, and the turning back of a lot of those could be certainly viewed as a large turning point.
Yeah, and I'll tag on to what Kevin mentioned as far as being a high tide at Perryville, and follow up with the Battle of Stones River, which comes as in the aftermath of the Battle of Perryville. Braxton Bragg and William Rosecrans tangle in Tennessee late December, early January 1862, 1863. And it's considered to be a draw, but enough of a tactical victory for Lincoln to go ahead and issue his Emancipation Proclamation. It's a very important point from the perspective that Lincoln's primary army under Ambrose Burnside had just been devastated by Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Lee had handed Burnside a one-sided defeat, and Stones River gave Lincoln the military teeth he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January, 1863.
I'll imperfectly sort of summarize my Polish brother's thoughts on this. Chris Kulikowski talks about the fall of 62 very much in the same terms that Chris White mentioned earlier about a big turn that a battleship might be taking. And so it's a really kind of a slow pivot. But these offensives that Kevin mentioned are sort of consummated finally with Stones River, because yes, those Confederate offensives do get turned back, but then the Union armies start to bog down again and have severe problems. Chickasaw Bayou, Fredericksburg, as Dan just mentioned. So Stones River, by the skin of the teeth is enough for Lincoln to say, "Whew, okay, we're going to move on with this," and that really does sort of change things and shift things in a pretty significant way. But, the turn back of those offensives earlier in the fall really doesn't become a sure thing until Stones River kind of, puts the nail in that.
And I'll tag on to a point Chris and Kevin just both made to a certain degree, is that riding that wave of negativity in Washington, D.C. with Abraham Lincoln is the fact that Ulysses S. Grant's offensive against Vicksburg has become bogged down as well when he's had his supply depot destroyed at Holly Springs by Earl Van Dorn, and Grant is forced to withdraw and essentially go back to the drawing board on how he's going to take Vicksburg. And
don't forget, Lincoln also faces a huge cabinet crisis right after the election. And, he's got people threatening to withdraw and resign, and his cabinet, his team of rivals are squabbling with each other, and he's able to sort of pocket some resignations and play one off after the other. So he's got all that he's dealing with too, on top of all these military affairs.
Yeah, to zoom it out to the 50,000 feet level, when you're looking at mid to late 1862, what you're dealing with is a midterm election year. So Lincoln, he primarily, the sitting power usually doesn't do well in a midterm election. So now he has to not only deal with the fact that Robert E. Lee in the Eastern Theater has taken over the Army of Northern Virginia, and the Army of the Potomac, his principal army, within 8 miles of Richmond. Now all of a sudden they're reeling and falling back towards the Potomac River, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then out west, you have the victory at Shiloh, and then you have Corinth, and you have victories at Island Number 10, and then Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, and the Confederacy is starting to shrink from the west towards the east. And Lincoln, to paraphrase, and we'll be talking to the French diplomat that's over here in America during the war, and he's going to say, look at all these great victories that we have out west. No one will pay attention to what we're doing out west. We're all focused here in the east, and it's because it's a very Eastern-centric, and even today, an Eastern-centric country, because this is where most of the major newspapers are. This is where the United States Capitol sits. It's where the Confederate Capitol will be over in Richmond, in Washington, D.C. So you have all these great victories happening out west. The Confederacy is starting to shrink, but then you have this guy, Robert E. Lee, who starts to rise to command. And as he rises to command, he starts to turn the war on its ear. And then you have guys like Don Carlos Buell, who won't go on the offensive like Lincoln wants to, and then you end up with Perryville and Braxton Bragg, fighting there. And one of the greatest allies for the Union cause, or two of the greatest allies for the Union cause, would be John Bell Hood and Braxton Bragg, because these two couldn't buy a victory, and they come so close. Chickamauga is about the only thing you can say for these two for a major victory. So it's Lincoln sees what's going on out west. And now you come into the Eastern Theater, you have the 7 days battles, and now Lee's going for broke. He feels that Richmond's not going to be is more secure when its defenders are not there. So what does he do? He starts sending Stonewall Jackson into the valley. He starts sending James Longstreet up behind, and they're going to start taking the war from central Virginia up to northern Virginia and then across the Potomac. So, and before we get to that, I just want to say hi to John Canister, Harry Smeltzer. I see he's joined us. Don Moody's here as always, so thank you everybody for jumping in. And Don mentioned that we are currently the American Battlefield Trust is trying to save land at Perryville. If you go to our website, battlefields.org, check out our homepage, you'll see your way that you can help contribute to the cause at Perryville. Even with all of this going on with the COVID around the country, we are still actively working on history content as well as preserving battlefields around the nation. So let's jump into late 1862, September of 1862. I know this is Kevin's bag here. I'll kick it over to him. Kevin, why don't we talk a little bit about Antietam as a turning point, and then I'll bring in Jim as well to talk Antietam and the emancipation as a turning point. What do you see as the Antietam campaign being crucial here in the late 1862 to Lincoln?
Well, as I mentioned, there's really Confederate counteroffensives, if you will, going across, it's at a 1,000-mile front, really from east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, east of the Shenandoah Valley with the Army of Northern Virginia, all the way out to the Mississippi River. And again, while it's not necessarily a coordinated Confederate counteroffensives, Lee's is the first one to be turned back. And it could be argued that with him being in the Eastern Theater, where a lot of the media attention is, and where Lincoln is focusing a lot of his attention in terms of meeting the bar for what he needs to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Antietam and the Maryland campaign are incredibly important to that. for Lincoln to have not so much at least a victory, but as he says, get Lee out of Maryland and back across the Potomac River into Virginia, is what he will need to announce to the country the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And as you've all mentioned, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is very much it's an unsure thing by the winter, getting into December of 1862. But nonetheless, the Emancipation Proclamation and the course that it ultimately steers the Union war effort on is certainly viewed as, I think, one of the more important turning points of the Civil War.
And I would add, I actually want to take us back a bit in time. And so these massive Confederate efforts, they're precipitated in some ways by the 1862 Conscription Act. So in April of 1862, the Confederate government takes this unprecedented move, unparalleled move at that point in time, that shows that their manpower is waning and that they're going to have to necessitate some really draconian measures that transform the whole tenor and shape of the Confederate government. That's what's going to start filling out these ranks that ultimately ensures about 80 to 85% of all white Southern men between the ages of 18 and 35 are going to take the field and be part of these campaigns. But I would also add to Kevin's point, the Peninsula Campaign is also going to figure very prominently in evolving Union policy. And so while we look to the fall of 1862 as the precipitating event for the Emancipation Proclamation, Union armies are seeing for the first time on the Virginia Peninsula the impact that enslaved labor is having in the construction of fortifications, in the amount coerced manpower that the Confederacy is able to mount. Union soldiers for the first time in many instances are encountering enslaved and freed peoples. And so we see this evolving policy that it really starts in the spring of 1862 and is fully realized in the late summer, early fall of 1862. But the Lincoln administration, as you're all saying absolutely correctly, is incredibly trepidatious to make any sort of overt move on that front. Nothing is decided. And so the earlier points about this idea of a turning point being a very fluid concept, I think that's absolutely critical. And it's so easy in hindsight to look back and say, yeah, of course, a victory in Maryland was going to ensure that Lincoln was going to issue the preliminary on the 22nd of September, and then the full 100 days later, the full emancipation. At the moment, anything was but that certain. And we could talk about the ripples of those gestures and how they even didn't really secure much at all. But I just would want to push back the narrative a bit into the spring of 1862.
And I think that illustrates really well the point I made earlier about how turning points are events that maybe happened and the course of history went on as we know it. And that touches on sort of the flip side of this is like, what if? Because, history continues on. What if on the peninsula, McClellan won? Would the Emancipation Proclamation have ever happened? Would the slaves have been freed? And so we know history as having progressed a certain way because of a turning point that went a certain way. And that sort of invites this thought about like these what if questions that really help illuminate those turning points and the flow of history as we know it.
Yeah, and it's a great point that Jim brings up. Essentially the Confederates install what Napoleon used during his wars, the levy en masse, to bring out the conscription acts. And also to Jim's point, you have to think about the fact that not only is Lincoln feeling pressure on the political front to push towards abolition, which will eventually help open up a new manpower pool with the Emancipation Proclamation in January of '63, when he's able to start really bringing African Americans into the United States Army. But you had in 1861 David Hunter pushing to emancipate the slaves around Savannah, and then you have Ben Butler with his famous, conscription or his famous act down on the peninsula himself, down at Fort Smith Monroe, turning them into contraband war. So you have this political, like Chris was just saying, the slow shift, the ship's turning. Lincoln's seeing it turn. It's just how quickly can he get it turned into 62. And I think, to take it from that front to the battlefront, when you look at what Robert E. Lee had done, especially in the Eastern Theater, he flips the war on its ear. He's going to take these 92,500 men that he takes over, and starting on January 25th of 1862, take them from around Richmond up across the Potomac River and threaten Washington. But in doing so, he's going to fight the 7 days battles Stonewall Jackson will fight at Cedar Mountain. You have the Second Manassas campaign, Chantilly, and then Antietam. So from point A to point B, you have an army that shrinks from 92,500 men down to under 30,000 men. And that's an attrition more for modern warfare that we think of that's going to wear out Lee. And that part, which is going to play to Jim's point, where he needs more guys. He has to bring in more men. So the Confederate Conscription Act will help out, while at the same time the Emancipation and these other acts by men like Ben Butler and the self-emancipation taking place in places like Fredericksburg will undermine the Confederacy, because you're going to lose that manpower pool of the slaves who are being either freed by Union soldiers or self-emancipating themselves and running towards freedom.
You've talked a bit about how Lee's ascension to command after Joe Johnston's wounding is sort of like one half of a pendulum swing. So instead of a turning point, the other end then is Chancellorsville, where he's got this great run of victories, and then Chancellorsville is kind of his high tide because he's bled his army out over the course of that whole arc of the pendulum swing, so that Chancellorsville then becomes another turning point for him. Can I ask you to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, and then Phil, I'll let you jump in. So the way I've always looked at it is Lee's army from June of 1862, late June, all the way up through early May of 1863. They're on this unprecedented string of victories in the Civil War, and so you look at Ulysses S. Grant out west. So as you go from this point, what Lee is doing is taking his army from that large manpower pool. He is going to have a lot of what they term in World War I wastage. As he goes up north, he'll have mass casualties, and the casualties is someone who's killed, wounded, missing, captured. It's not just someone who's killed, and so you're going to have this army shrink to under about 30,000. Then it's going to balloon again because you're going to have not only new units coming into the army, you have these conscripts, and you also have the wounded returning, as well as the shirkers who have fallen off the wayside, or some of the guys who went home for the fall harvest and came back, which was a problem in the Confederate Army at times. And then you have the Battle of Fredericksburg, which Lee's really upset about, actually. He felt that he could have a great victory there. He's unable to crush the Union Army. He's very upset about it. And then you get to Chancellorsville, where at Chancellorsville, I look at it as the last true bleeding out of the Army before it all goes downhill. Lee's going to lose 64 out of 130 regimental commanders at Chancellorsville. Obviously he loses Stonewall Jackson, but what he had been losing from the peninsula up to Chancellorsville were his line officers, his field grade officers, many of his generals. So, he's losing the best of his best and the brightest. And the Confederates, unlike the Union armies in many places, usually put their best and the brightest at the top as the war started. And then as the war went on, obviously the men who came up behind them weren't as good. And the Union Army, you can notice a lot of these political appointees, once they're either cashiered from the Army, transferred, or they're killed or wounded in action, you allow the Union cream to rise to the top. And that's what seems to happen once you hit Gettysburg. You have a Union high command who's working on all cylinders, and the Confederates who just can't get out of their own way because they have sustained such heavy casualties over that period. And I think Kevin thinks this as well. The June of 1862 to September of 1862 is the first overland campaign of the Eastern Theater, where it's just a grinding battle after battle, and that attrition will eventually catch up to Lee once he crosses into Pennsylvania.
Well, I think Joseph Harsh in his great book on that campaign, I mean, really, and Kevin will agree with this, envisions that period as this dramatic shift in one overarching campaign. We have to really connect June to September of 1862, and the attrition rate they talked about, Chris, I think is just an exquisite point. And I don't have the number in front of me, but I want to say Joe Glatar quotes something like 75% of all the A and V officer corps is either going to be killed or wounded over the course of the conflict. I think that number is right, which is just absolutely staggering.
You're correct, Jim. It's about 75%. Okay. I did the math individually. Okay. Through Second Manassas alone, it's over 830 line officers, and then going up in the field grade, it was like 175. It's insane. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah.
No, go ahead. No, you're right.
No, please go on. Continue.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Okay. yeah. It's
and to that point about really everything from almost the 7 days to the end of the Maryland campaign being one campaign. It's very interesting to read letters from both Union and Confederate soldiers in the aftermath of the Maryland campaign talking about how they, it's roughly an 18-day campaign, but they talk about how they haven't had tents, change of clothes for a month and a half, 2 months in some cases. And so very much so, they are looking at this as just one long continuation of events from the peninsula all the way to the banks of the Potomac.
Yeah, it's, and then you have the Battle of Antietam, which is going to push back that Confederate tide in the east. Out west, it's going to be Perryville that pushes them back towards the south. And then for essentially, the next few months, you'll have kind of status quo, and then you'll have the Battle of the Stones River, which is, I know Chris Kolakowski again talks about that as a great turning point because it gave Lincoln the leverage that he needed in that winter of 1862-63, meaning that, there's this defeat at Chickasaw Bayou where Sherman is defeated outside of Vicksburg. He writes the shortest OR, official records report of the entire war. It's like 3 sentences. Basically, we came, we got our butts kicked, we left. I'm going to paraphrase Sherman. He also is going to, have the setback, obviously the terrible setback at Fredericksburg, and then you finally have this victory out at Stones River where Braxton Bragg again beats himself rather than William Rosecrans' army probably beating him, even though they had something to do with it. So that gives Lincoln the gravitas to sign on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, and to that point, he actually thanks Rosecrans for the victory because he's able to sign the Emancipation, even though it doesn't free slaves in areas that are not in rebellion. It's going to send a distinct message, and it's also going to allow them to start arming these illegally freed African Americans and bring them into the army. And with that, I think we should jump in 1863 to keep it warm with it. Phil, you got something?
I just wanted to, before we left 1860, we talked a lot about battlefields and we talked a lot about the military side of it, but one of the genius is in that political realm of Lincoln compared to Jefferson Davis. And you just look at some of the things that Lincoln was able, I don't want to say bait, but to reclassify the view of the war. 61, the Star of the West, trying to resupply, getting the Confederates to shoot on Fort Sumter. 1862, using Kentucky neutrality, letting Leonidas Polk initially invade the state and so forth. Then even farther out west in the Trans-Mississippi, what he's doing as far as in the New Mexico territory and Arizona territory, allowing the local commanders autonomy to do what they needed to do. You actually have the first integrated units in the New Mexico territory, with the 1st New Mexico has Hispanics serving with white soldiers that fight at the Battle of Val Verde and so forth. So we always talk about battlefields as these turning points. You're seeing that Davis is maybe a great military administrator, but the big political spectrum, he's losing focus as he narrows down, especially becoming more and more Eastern centric as Lincoln tries to look at bigger pictures of what's going on to try to defeat the Confederacy in multiple views. So those are slow turning points they're not sexy turning points because they're not battlefield charges. But keeping Kentucky and also losing that the Confederates building that myth that there are soldiers in Kentucky or there are soldiers in Maryland. Being from Baltimore, I mean, most Southern leading people are on the East Coast. Lee invades the wrong part of the state, but that's the reason why you can get. So there's different things that are outside the battlefield. At 62, you start to see that Confederate policy is reaching that high tide or that turning point, and it's across the board. But Kentucky is, example from probably mispronouncing, but Paducah to Mill Springs, to Perryville is the kind of the trifecta of bad mistakes in the state of Kentucky.
Also, before we leave 1862, just want to mention Shiloh, at least briefly. Up to that point, everyone's still kind of thinking that the war is not going to be a big, awful, terrible thing. We're just going to have a couple fights and duke it out and things will just kind of settle down. And then the sheer scope of casualties at Shiloh is a huge, very grim wake-up call to both North and South. And there's that great line that says, "The South never smiled again after Shiloh," because of just the sheer carnage on the battlefield. And that sort of proves Sherman right when he said that this was just going to be an awful war. Well, look, he's got Shiloh suddenly to back him up on that. And so I think that was really a sobering moment in the history of the Civil War as a turning point.
Yeah, and you're live with the American Battlefield Trust. This is Zoom Goes to History. We're talking high tides and turning points in the American Civil War. We've got Jim Broomall, Dan Davis, Chris Mikowski, Kevin Pollack, and Phil Greenwald. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. Please share this with your friends and your family on Facebook, and we'll be doing more of these Zooms coming up. Phil brought up a great point. I could just fall into a rabbit hole. The two distinct leadership styles of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, and Jefferson Davis. I think that Davis is going to run the war much like Winston Churchill tried to dabble in the war all the time, trying to talk to Dwight Eisenhower and give him all kinds of different advice whenever they're going forward throughout the Second World War, even during the First World War. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole. So in 1863, obviously, we have a couple of large ones to talk about. Gettysburg. Everybody loves Gettysburg. To me, I think the turning point we started talking about a little bit earlier was Chancellorsville. I think Chancellorsville in the East is a larger turning point than what Gettysburg would be, and for the reasons being that Lee's army is so battered once even though it's put back together for the second time in 18 months. He's going to carry that army north, and it's going to be a shell of itself, because at Chancellorsville, as I mentioned, they lose a half of the regimental commanders on that field are killed, wounded, and missing for the Confederates. They're going to lose 9 general officers there, killed, wounded, or missing. And they're also going to lose a large amount of brigade commanders. I can't remember off the top of my head how many brigade commanders. And when Lee wins that battle, quote unquote, wins that battle, the Union Army is not defeated. The Union Army is actually shocked that they gave up the field, that Joe Hooker gave up that field. So when the Union Army starts marching north towards Gettysburg, which a lot of people think of the turning point, you have this army who has a chip on its shoulder. They've been losing so many times, but now they thought they were within grasp of winning that battle of Chancellorsville. If they stuck it out, most likely they would have been, because Lee was greatly outnumbered 2-1, and Hooker, by the end of it, was in a fixed fortified position, and all he had to do was sit back with his artillery and allow Lee to attack him. It was finally the position that Hooker needed and wanted at the outset of the campaign, but Hooker gave up the fight there. That's my take on Chancellorsville. Anyone else? I know, Chris, you hate the Chancellorsville battlefield, even though you're living on it right now.
Well, and I think that, when Joe Hooker takes command of that army, and it's at its absolute lowest point after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and he rebuilds it and he restructures it, he reforms it, and really turns it into the trim fighting force that it is at Chancellorsville and at Gettysburg. It's really Hooker's army that does fight at Gettysburg. You just didn't have the leadership at Chancellorsville that the army needed and deserved. And so you kind of see the culmination of that transformation that begins in the winter of 63, finally comes of age at Gettysburg. So I think that whole period is so crucial.
Yeah, and to tag on to what Chris White just mentioned, I think at Gettysburg, the Army of the Potomac does have a chip on its shoulder, but I think to a certain degree it's looking for a little bit of redemption from Fredericksburg, and to follow on to that, the Battle of Chancellorsville. What I find ironic about Chancellorsville is that here you have on May 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee, after dividing his forces twice, he's going to do it again for a third time. He's at the pinnacle of his success as an army commander, but yet he has bled, again, as Chris mentioned, he has bled his army white. He has lost so many line officers, so many brigade commanders, and obviously will within a week lose a corps commander as well.
It's all downhill for Lee after Chancellorsville. I mean, people talk about Gettysburg as his high tide. He never scores an offensive battlefield victory after Chancellorsville. So that really, for me, is the high tide of the Confederacy. Yeah,
and he will begin, and Chancellorsville is really the beginning of Lee starting to lose those major corps, those critical corps commanders. It starts with Jackson, and then it begins to snowball once you get into the spring of 1864.
And at the same time that you have Chancellorsville, roughly the same time, you have some problems on the Confederate home front. You're going to start looking at the bread riots that take place in Richmond, the Union blockade, the Navy that really most people don't discuss all that often, outside of the Monitor and the Merrimack and maybe the Hunley and Housatonic. When you start looking at the home front, you're starting to see the Confederate morale start to break down. And it's not just the morale of these soldiers, it's the trickle down effect. It'll be the wives and the sweethearts who are going to then write to those men on the front lines, telling them just how terrible things are back here, and we need you back at home because X, Y, or Z is happening. And you have shortages across the board because of these, not only the Union blockade, but of course these Union armies who are starting to cut into the Deep South and now here through ravaging Northern Virginia, which is really a no man's land. Anybody have anything to?
I mean, it's ironic in that Confederate production sort of ramps up in 1863. They find their footing finally in the transition period of 1862, but at the same time, as you said, Chris, they're facing insurmountable issues on the home front. I mean, there's a loss of morale going from Virginia down to the Deep South into the Gulf Coast that is just catastrophic, and it's unprecedented in the United States. There's European parallels, but I think no one had expected the events to unfold in the winter and spring of 1863, with most famously, of course, the bread riots in Richmond, but they occur throughout the Confederacy. And then women actively start petitioning Zeb Vance, Joe Brown, Jefferson Davis. I mean, Drew Faust goes so far as to argue that basically the shifts that occur in the home front in 1863 start to signal the death knell of the Confederacy. I mean, it's a pretty bold argument, but there's something to be said where if you lose the support of this critical component of the populace at the same time that probably 500,000 plus African Americans are fleeing the plantation complex, you have the internal collapse of a society in 1863. So militarily, though Lee is, as we've all said, having a lot of trouble from this point forward, the home front itself is not going to be able to sustain the conflict as is so necessary. And so again, this winter, spring 1863 is absolutely critical. And as you said so well, Chris, soldiers start getting these demoralizing letters and desertion rates start to rise in the ranks of the ANV, which I've studied at least the most. I'm sure the same is true for the AOT and elsewhere. But I mean, that has a profound impact on the morale of many, many units, and diminishes their fighting capability and their esprit de corps, no matter how bonded those men have become as soldiers, because they've weathered these campaigns together. The suffering that they're seeing on the home front is extraordinarily difficult for them to just simply ignore.
Yeah, if you look at the parallels between the First World War, Germany in 1918, late 1918, you're seeing the same parallels that you see in the Confederacy starting in 1863 and 64, whereas the Army seems to be doing okay on the Western Front, but what's happening is starvation at home. 250,000 or more Germans or civilians are dying at home, and it's starting to collapse the government. It's collapsing the social structures at home, and that's what ends up ending the First World War, larger than the battlefield victories of the Allies. So let's move forward a little bit here so that we can finish off. So anybody have anything to say about let's say the little battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania? Is that a turning point? Has anybody ever heard of this one? I'm not sure. Gary was here. I know he might have something.
I feel like we should go like this and talk about Gettysburg, and then Gary can
all at once.
Yeah, so we can invoke Gary.
Well, let's just make a mention. It's a point that's I don't know if it makes much sense, but I always felt one of the turning points in Gettysburg that's under study is it's a officer lost battle and a soldier almost won victory by the Confederate Army. I mean, you look at the individualness of the soldiers and how close they came, the personal battles that happened. Like the Longstreet's Corps, we're always looking at July 2nd, Longstreet's Corps, how it was mismanaged from the top down. But what those guys went through to just get to the battlefield of marching so many hours and then having the prowess to charge up Little Round Top, to go through the wheat field and the peach orchard, and from just that perspective, the soldiers, but the officer corps, how it's complete almost failure across the board from what Longstreet's command decisions were, why Lafayette McLaws was doing what he did and not being obstinate about turning around. Where was Richard Anderson or A.P. Hill on their part of it as well? So you see the absence of leadership. We're not even going to touch the cavalry. But I always thought that one thing that gets understudied is that parallel between the officer corps and the soldiery of the Army of Northern Virginia. And you just see how well of a machine the Army of Northern Virginia is, how close they are on July 2nd at certain times. The soldiers are from punching through. And it's the loss of the officer corps once again, or new people and new roles that cost it. What's the reason? It's Chancellorsville, because of the loss and the restructuring. And now you're going forward with a lot of people in new positions and trying to figure out new commands and so forth. But that's a turning point there is, they lost the officer corps, but also the last how much big trust Lee has in just the rank and file and of his men, and the trust that they have in Lee in doing these attacks.
Yeah. I know this isn't a Gettysburg-centric talk, and I'll just say this: what Lee's army suffers in casualties. Once you get up there, the command structure starts to break down. And a lot of it has to do with Robert E. Lee. People won't blame Robert E. Lee. It's his command style. You know, if you want to win a war, you bring Grant. If you want to win a battle, you bring Robert E. Lee. So when you start looking at these command structures and styles, Lee was always about, you know, taking a calculated risk, and he encouraged it. That's what why Jackson, when Jackson was let off his own leash to go do what he needed to do, was so good. And same with Longstreet at times, even though he needed more supervision. But you flip to the Union side, I don't think they get enough credit at Gettysburg. When you look at that chain of command, it's a wreck. You have a brand new Army commander with George Gordon Meade. You got a left wing commander with John Reynolds, who's killed in action. So you have the First Corps, who was under Abner Doubleday, and then he loses command on July 2nd to John Newton. Second Corps goes to Winfield Scott Hancock, who essentially is elevated to a wing commander. And then you have John Gibbon take over that corps, especially after Hancock's wounding. Sickles is wounded in the battle. Fifth Corps is under a brand new corps commander. Sixth Corps is under John Sedgwick, and I've studied him for 7 years. I wouldn't bring him to a fight. Then you have Oliver Otis Howard, who becomes a wing commander, and who shouldn't even be a corps commander at this point. And then you have Henry Slocum, who's the 12th Corps commander, and then, of course, Alfred Pleasanton, who couldn't tell the truth to save his life. So you have this crazy chain of command, and somehow the Union Army is able to overcome it. But the Confederates, who are working with veterans, but who are largely in new roles, just like their Union counterparts, can't overcome it. And I always say that it's because coming to the top are these more quality officers in the Union forces, whereas the Confederates are losing their quality officers due to attrition. And I think attrition is a big deal. Let's jump back out west for a minute. Let's talk the campaign that everybody loves, Tullahoma. And I know everybody's heard of Tullahoma and Vicksburg, those two campaigns. James McPherson kind of puts three turning points in the war. 1862, it's the Emancipation and it's Antietam. 1863, it's Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Tullahoma. And then 64, the election of 1864. So anybody want to tackle the Tullahoma campaign or Vicksburg to kick it off?
I know Rosecrans said, don't forget about Tullahoma just because the campaign was not written in letters of blood. And that seems to have been what happened, because he successfully maneuvers the Confederates out of Tennessee, basically regains half the state, and nobody remembers anything about it because he doesn't have a huge battle as a result. And because, Gettysburg takes place, that overshadows it. Vicksburg takes place, which of the three I think is probably the most important because it severs the Confederacy in half. The strategic picture changes significantly when Vicksburg falls, whereas Lee's still able to move with relative impunity after Gettysburg, and Rosecrans sort of gets a little afraid of his own shadow and quiets down there after Tullahoma. Vicksburg is a huge game changer.
I think in 1863 as well, looking out west, you could really not point to a couple of different events, but just one person in Ulysses S. Grant. I think just his persistence at finally tackling the Vicksburg problem, and then of course Rosecrans's gains in Tennessee are almost undone. In the fall of 63, following Chickamauga, and his army is besieged there at Chattanooga, and Grant comes out bringing portions of his army of the Tennessee to help break the siege of Chattanooga. And so Grant is just all over the board out west, and he always seems to be at a key moment there when again, as you mentioned, Chris, things could have turned on a dime one way or the other, and Grant was there to make sure it tipped in the Union's favor.
Yeah, and such is the situation with Chattanooga. The Confederates take Chattanooga, they close off the way to Georgia. No one's going to be talking about what Grant did just several months earlier in capturing Vicksburg. That losing Chattanooga, coupled with Rosecrans's loss at Chickamauga, would have offset Grant's gains from, I believe, from the Vicksburg campaign and the capture of Vicksburg. So to me, Chattanooga does a couple of things. It solidifies, at least in Lincoln's mind, that Grant is the man to lead the Union effort going into early 1864, but it also solidifies the Union gains in the West, and it serves as a launching pad for William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign against Atlanta.
Not to belabor a point to death, but once again, the failure of management of Jefferson Davis in the war effort in 63. What he does with Joe Johnston, putting him in department command, but then giving other orders to John Pemberton, you have to know the people you're working with, and you have to know your subordinates. Pemberton is an administrative person. He'll to do the paperwork. But you put him in the field, Champions Hill is a complete fiasco, and then you give him a guy like Loring, who can't even work with. I mean, Jackson almost resigns because of Loring. So you give him that, but at the same time, he also, what does he do with Bragg? He keeps him in command, allows dissent in it, that whole vote of confidence thing. What is he doing? And so what he does is, I mean, Lincoln ignores the, what he's been told about Grant until something happens in Vicksburg, because Grant's leash, people want him removed. He's drinking again. He's a drunkard. He's failing at this and so forth. But you see this failure of man because of what's happening with either meddling or not meddling. So, I mean, you either go all the way in or you stay all the way out. And what happens is you have these crazy lines of command and control in the West, which causes Vicksburg to fall and causes a vote of no confidence with Bragg and leads to Chickamauga being a hollow victory.
Yeah, my favorite less than Bragg was that Jefferson Davis tried to do what God himself could not do, make a general officer out of Braxton Bragg. So you're looking at some of our comments here with the American Battlefield Trust on Zoom Goes the History, talking high tides and turning points in the American Civil War. I see Don Moody on here saying we should be on Hollywood Squares. So I just put up our Hollywood Squares look. I'll take Chris Mikowski for the win. And then we've got arguments going on here. It looks like someone's arguing with themselves at one point. And some people saying that Lee was going to take Washington. That would end the war. I don't believe that, because the U.S. Capitol fell twice, once in 1777, once in 1814, and we're still here. So moving forward, we talked a lot about a guy named Grant. So I think late 1863 is the time to bring Grant in here. And we'll have to pick up the pace here to get us through 64, because we're having a great conversation, but it is going on. So 1863, late 1863, we have the Battle of Chickamauga in September. It's going to be Braxton Bragg's one great battlefield victory, but he doesn't follow it up as he goes towards Chattanooga, and the Union Army is besieged there under initially William Rosecrans, and then eventually it'll be under Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant's going to be our guy who cleans everything up. He goes out and wins Forts Henry and Donelson, wins at Shiloh, is relieved of command, has to come back, is constantly seemed to have an uphill battle, but this seems to be the last test before he gets the big call into the game. So anybody want to try to tackle Chattanooga quickly and the rise of Ulysses S. Grant?
I think Grant himself probably articulates it best, because when he is dying of throat cancer and he's writing his memoirs and writing some articles for Century Magazine, instead of writing about Appomattox, he swaps that out for Chattanooga. He thinks that writing about Chattanooga is more important than writing about Appomattox. The editors of Century Magazine are absolutely apoplectic about it. They think, of course, our readers want to know about Appomattox. But Grant saw Chattanooga as such a key moment in his career and in the course of the war. And to me, that has always spoke volumes.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I know when Dwight Eisenhower writes his memoirs in 1948, Crusade in Europe, which is an international bestseller, he bases it on the way that Ulysses S. Grant wrote his memoirs. And so I know that has a long-reaching impact. So Grant's going to win or break the siege of Chattanooga. It's not so much a siege, because there is an open line coming down, known as the Cracker Line. But regardless, Grant brings home the victory in late 1863, when at the same time in the Eastern Theater, George Gordon Meade can't land a killing blow on Robert E. Lee. So what do we have happen now? March of 1864, here comes Grant to the east. Can we look at one man being promoted to the three-star general to be a turning point? Does it have to be a battle? I see it as a turning point. Anyone else?
Absolutely. I mean, he changes the entire strategic landscape of the war all across the country by starting to move armies in coordinated conjunction with each other, so that Confederates can't use their interior lines to move reinforcements. So that ties down Confederates all across the map. And then his armies just start moving and wearing down the Confederates. If by no other means than attrition, he says, he's going to wear the Confederates out. That's a huge, huge strategic shift.
Yeah,
it's a political turning point, I think, too, from Lincoln's perspective, facing re-election in the midst of the Civil War. He pushes all of his chips to the middle of the table, and he puts his faith in the one commander who, up until that point in time, has been the most successful.
It's interesting, though, as we talk about turning points. I mean, and Grant does find the formula, and I fully agree with everything that's been said. But the overland campaign is such a difficult, arduous undertaking. The casualties are so high that even moving into the late summer of 1864, Lincoln's reelection isn't necessarily that assured. And so, on the one hand, yes, like there is this critical turning point in the figure of Grant, and I've studied him for years. I've read his writings. I just like him a great deal. And he does find that formula, but this idea of uncertainty is what we have to always return back to, because the summer of 1864 is so incredibly difficult. The casualty counts are catastrophic. The armies just continually are slogging it out day after day after day. That's incredibly hard on morale, incredibly hard on esprit de corps. And so it just shows us that even though it seems like, okay, well, Appomattox is now just around the corner, Lincoln's reelection is certainly reassured. Well, no. That's going to take a couple of events in the late summer, early fall of 1864 to finally get that formula to work. So I just like this idea of contingency is what we have to kind of go back to.
Yeah, and we are looking at it easily, 150 years later. They didn't know at the time what it's going to look like. So when we're saying, let's say August of 1864, you have Lee, who's trying to break out of Petersburg by relieving the pressure of sending troops out to the Shenandoah Valley. You have in the Deep South, Nathaniel Banks had failed at the Red River earlier in the year. The Bermuda 100 campaign was a failure. The only bright spot right now, or two, if you want to call it a bright spot, is one, you have Lee tied down at least. It's not a great bright spot, but at least he's not loose. But the other one is that Sherman is marching his way, towards Atlanta. And I think once you get later in 1864, the two things that will solidify Lincoln's reelection, and as Dan pointed out, it's he's writing letters. Lincoln has a letter on his desk, essentially like Eisenhower had if D-Day failed, saying that it was his fault. What you're looking at is the victory at Atlanta in September, and then you have the victories in the Shenandoah Valley under Phil Sheridan. And those victories, because they're in the Eastern Theater, I believe, are closer to home. So people are saying, okay, here's victories here. Atlanta has now fallen. Lee's bottled up. Maybe this thing's starting to go the way we want to. And that finally, it's up until late October, and the elections in November that Lincoln doesn't know if he's going to be reelected. George McClellan was a very famous man in the United States and very popular, but he wanted to end this war, and these soldiers have been fighting for so long. I think the morale of the Union forces, having fought for so long and sustained those hellacious casualties, as Jim pointed out, I think that carries into the ballot box. So much so that even if you go to Andersonville, the soldiers there are allowed to vote. It's not counted. It's an unofficial vote, but they unanimously or almost unanimously reelect Abraham Lincoln, even though they're stuck in this horrible cesspool of a POW camp. So I think that's an interesting point that Jim brings up. Presentism is a real thing, and we're somebody like, it's fine, he had it locked up. No, he absolutely did.
And I think that the election then becomes that great turning point of like that point of no return, because once Lincoln does get reelected, that pretty much nails down the way the war is going to be prosecuted and carried out, and there's no going back after that. So that becomes a huge, huge point.
Yeah, and I'll offer up that Phil Sheridan's campaign against Jubal Early in the Shenandoah Valley is sort of like the Chattanooga just a year later. Sherman has taken Atlanta in September, early September. Early and Sheridan are going to fight their first battle 17 days after Atlanta falls. Here, the Union Army is going into a place where they have not won before in the Shenandoah Valley. And if Sheridan is dealt a major defeat, it's going to offset the gains that Sherman had made earlier in the month in Georgia. So to a certain degree, I think one of the biggest turning points or major battles of the war comes at the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19th, 1864. It will be the last major battle in the major theater of Virginia before the voters go to the polls just a few weeks later. And it starts out incredibly, horribly, absolutely awful for the Federals. Jubal Early is able to crush 2 Union Corps, more than something that even Stonewall Jackson never been able to do. But thanks to the 6th Corps and some of the very solid division and brigade commanders, he's able to rally. They launch a counterattack and they push Early from the field and eventually rout Early's army off the field. So it cannot be underscored enough that the Valley campaign in 1864 is, I think, a turning point into and of itself. It's the last thing that the northern population is going to be thinking about when they go to the polls to either reelect Lincoln or elect a new president.
Yeah, and that election of Lincoln, in and of itself is a turning point. Throughout the war, Lincoln had been trying wartime Reconstruction. He starts it in New Orleans, where he's trying to see how Reconstruction can go under wartime circumstances. Then he starts to take more dramatic actions with the Emancipation Proclamation. And then as you enter early 1865, you start to see the seeds being planted in the halls of Congress and in the Senate, with the 13th Amendment now going to be a viable option to end slavery throughout the United States, because Lincoln has been reelected. If he's not, this can turn the entire way the war turn it on its ear. Potentially McClellan does come in, and it's a big what if game, but he comes in, he can end the war. The Confederate States are the Confederate States, and the North is the United States. And we've done all of this really for not. You're back to almost status quo antebellum. Anyone else have any thoughts on Lincoln's reelection?
Well, then, as you pointed out, it certainly makes the 13th Amendment possible, which again is a huge turning point. Freeing the slaves and making into law what Lincoln had been using as basically a war power up to that point. So that becomes huge, and that, of course, then paves the way for the 14th and 15th Amendments. So huge implications from a civil rights point of view because of Lincoln's reelection.
Yeah, and essentially once you get into 1865, I'm not sure you could call it a turning point. I think that as we close up here in the next few minutes on Zoom Goes a History, talking high tides and turning points in the American Civil War with the American Battlefield Trust, we hope that you'll share this with your friends and with your family. Looking at the last days of the siege of Petersburg, looking at the fight at Five Forks when George Pickett's division and the cavalry out there with him are having a shad bake and a runoff, or captured almost en masse, which is going to have long-term impacts on Petersburg. And Grant's told, if the thing is pressed, we think we can end this thing eventually. And he says, let this thing be pressed. So we have the breakthrough at Petersburg the next day, which will then speed up everything to Appomattox Courthouse, which is today is the anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Is there anything else that we can see in early 1865? A potential turning point earlier in the war could have been the promotion in January of 65 of Robert E. Lee to the status of Ulysses S. Grant, but it comes too little too late in my book. And then on March 23rd of 1865, there's evidence that really the only evidence that I know of that the Confederates are starting to try to arm African Americans. And there's something in the Richmond Examiner talking about white troops and black troops starting to actually go out into the streets and to drill, but they never see action because it's so far late in the war. Does anyone have anything else to say on that front?
I would suggest that Lincoln's assassination was a turning point of the war. Brian Matthew Jordan's the one who's kind of got me thinking about this with his book Marching Home, because the soldiers recognized that the work of the war was not done just because Lee and Johnston and others had surrendered. They still had to win the peace and really establish what the war meant. Lincoln had a pretty definite vision of how he wanted that to go, with malice toward none, charity for all. He told Porter and Grant, let him up easy. But he never really articulated his specifics for the plan. And then when he's assassinated, nobody knows what he had been thinking. And so Johnson takes over, it becomes an absolute mess. His administration really kind of botches Reconstruction, a lot of political fighting, impeachment, et cetera, et cetera. So Lincoln's death really shifts the unfinished work of the war in pretty significant ways that I think remain unfinished today.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, how does that, not only within the reconstructed South, the old states of the Confederacy, how does that, as the nation continues to move west beyond the Mississippi, how does Lincoln's assassination and Johnson's presidency, Grant's subsequent presidency, how does that influence the westward expansion as America moves toward California, California moves toward the Mississippi? Do things go differently as far as what we know today as the post-Civil War Indian Wars on the southern plains and the northern plains? Would Lincoln have handled those situations differently than what ultimately happened? So I think you can extrapolate Lincoln's assassination out beyond the Mississippi, if you will.
What about the surrenders that do happen? And I mean, especially Joseph Johnston's at the Bennett place, that he does not, he defies Jefferson Davis and the fight to go on. And both Lee and Johnston and all them, the major pros, that you don't have this breakout of an extra war, a guerrilla war, or this, let's go, you've been great soldiers, now become great citizens. I mean, the go home, the blanket pros that Johnston, 89,000, 90,000 men from the whole southeast seaboard. So I think that speaks something of, the role that Lee and Johnston both had in that, hey, we fought the good fight, it's over, now let's return to peace, because it could have disintegrated into a continued war of this guerrilla or this continued sniping like you see in the Wild Wild West. You saw in Missouri for a few years, and you see kind of the lawlessness of the Southwest.
Phil brings that up. I mean, this is something that I've been really intrigued by, and I'm not too into what if scenarios, but I mean, things are very precarious in April of 1865. Davis has this early proclamation in early April that's kind of ambiguous, suggesting the war might take a different phase. There are lots of Confederate soldiers in the A and V who begin moving farther down to North Carolina, the Trans-Mississippi. They're seemingly going to continue the fight. Confederate citizens are leaving the slave-holding Confederacy, moving down to Mexico and Cuba into 1865-66. It's this moment of what if, and there is this, as Phil alluded to, there is this possibility that perhaps the fighting men are going to change fronts and phases, and that this is going to blow up into a guerrilla war. And there were some high-ranking officers who said that this is a possibility. E. Porter Alexander is one in his memoirs, at least, who talks about it. And both Lee and Johnston have these very definitive ideas about the transition back into citizenship. And it does set sort of a model that most do ultimately adhere to. There's about 10,000, we think, white Southerners who flee the Confederacy. They never continued another fight, of course. But in April of 1865, it is not yet certain that the war is going to conclude so neatly. And in fact, there is a period of tumult in the 6 months that follow, just because there is no real government during the transition period. But April 1865 is very unpredictable, and there is this moment where things could have gone in a very different direction had most of the enlisted men not chosen to adhere to, a code of honor and a more traditional military surrender. So it's something to, again, think about, that these are actually turning points because of the possibility that was looming, and that some indeed followed in some capacity.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jim. You have Confederates like George Pickett and Jubal Early who flee the country because they're worried about potential war crimes, specifically George Pickett for incident at New Bern, North Carolina in 1864. So you have these guys, they don't know what's going to happen to them. Jefferson Davis has been arrested and in prison. So anything really could happen from that point. So I think with this, we'll wrap it up. Can we say that there's one turning point, or this is a slow turning ship of many, many, many small turning points that are going to take us to the end of the American Civil War?
Yeah, I go with the dominoes theory.
Yeah.
Many small.
Yeah, many.
It's like the pinpricks, many pinpricks. Well, I want to thank Jim Broomall from Shepherd University. He's the director of the George C. Tyler Civil War Center. We have Dan Davis, who's the Education Associate at the American Battlefield Trust. Dr. Chris Mikowski from St. Bonaventure University and Emerging Civil War. Bill Greenwald from Emerging Revolutionary War, as well as the National Park Service. And Kevin Pollock, who is with Prince William County Parks and Bristow Station Battlefield. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust. We hope that you enjoyed Zoom Goes to History. We'll have more for you tomorrow, showing you some behind the scenes at the American Battlefield Trust. If you want to know how we make our maps, well, you need to tune in tomorrow, and we'll find out. We'll be talking with Steve Stanley and John Mitchell, our cartographers. We'll have more Zoom Goes to Histories over the next few weeks. Some great topics, including some Revolutionary War topics. So please share this with your friends and with your families. Gentlemen, thank you for your time this evening. Please stay safe in the time of COVID, and the rest of our viewers, please do the same.